Hello, my name is Char Denord. I'm the Poet Laureate of Vermont, and welcome to Poets Speak, a monthly program in which I interview a poet from Vermont and talk about their poetry and what they're working on now as far as their new work, and to introduce folks from Vermont to poetry in Vermont. Often it's poetry that crosses over the border of Vermont into all of the states of the country. Today I'm very happy to welcome Alison Prine to the show. Alison was born in Pittsburgh, grew up in Pittsburgh, went to Earlham College, and then moved to Vermont, actually to Burlington, Vermont, where she's lived ever since. She was writing poetry the whole time. She was living here in Vermont after graduating from college, but not thinking so much about publishing, which was a great thing. Most poets today often try to publish right away, maybe when they're not quite ready, but Alison waited until she was ready, and then she wrote this wonderful book, this beautiful book called Steal, which was a finalist in the Vermont Book Prize 2 years ago, and has received a lot of attention and praise from around the country. I would like to read Jeff Harrison's note here. He was the judge for this book that won the Cider Press Review Book Award, which was another huge honor for Alison. He wrote about this book: two tragic events haunt this powerful first collection: the early loss of the poet's mother and her brother's death, the kind of events that change the alignment of every season after and tear open vast absences in a life. Alison Prine bravely explores those absences here, engaging in the struggle to make something immune to ruin out of what is broken and to mend the connections severed by death, even while acknowledging the inability of language to fill the void left by loved ones or to find easy answers. This isn't consolation, as she says in one poem. Instead, poem by poem, she makes a dwelling for herself and the reader, building from the inside, while remaining attuned to the possibility of correspondences in the outside world. And through the quiet urgency of her voice, she finds a secular way of praying. This book is a blessing, and I couldn't agree more. Wonderful to have you here with us today, Alison, and welcome to Poets Speak.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you might want to start by reading a poem,
Okay.
and then we can begin talking about the poems and your life as well.
I guess I'll read the first poem in the book, which is called "The Engineers Taught Us."
Great.
To check 100 times a day, and tomorrow we will keep on checking. Everything is here: messages, filters, compass, wisdom, music, news of the world, time of day everywhere, locators, something of my old life, the childhood neighbor's laugh, burned patch from the shag rug of 1979, phone numbers of the dead. When I admitted that for months after his suicide, I left my brother voicemails, my sisters all said they had called him too. We are believers. Dear engineers, please put me in touch with those who have trespassed against me. The fortune teller will not take the engineer to be her lawfully wedded wife. Together they will not provide the navigation tools to fill me with a greenhouse of hibiscus. My smartphone offers no shelter. There is only building from the inside and its necessary loneliness. It's a terrible machine that won't let me lose.
Really wonderful, beautiful poem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good one to start with. When did you start writing the poems in this book? I get the impression that they were brewing in you for a long time.
I don't know exactly, because I didn't write this collection as a collection. I hadn't really thought about at this point I had started thinking about publication, and some of these poems were published. I think probably around maybe 2007 is the earliest poems in the collection, and I think the collection was accepted in 2014. So there was a lot of years
Right.
Of poetry there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're writing about such a huge subject in all of these poems with just amazing courage. When did you realize that you wanted to express the grief that you were feeling, really since childhood, into, say, poetry instead of prose, or just in talking?
I fell in love with poetry as a child. My father read me poetry. I loved it. I wrote poetry as a child and as a teenager in my journal. And I remember I never studied poetry formally, but I remember as a teenager just going to the public library and pulling poetry books off the shelf and finding that that poetry, that reading poetry could sort of reach a part of me that no other art form could. So it's always been my love, poetry.
Right. Well, in poem after poem, you display the paradox of poetry, by which I mean you connect unlike things and make sense out of them. And most of these unlike things are things, if you will, in the landscape, in weather. And I was wondering, maybe you could read a poem in which you do that. I think there's so many. To Bide, or your wonderful poem about about apples, into apples. But I'd let you choose which one you maybe like to.
I'll read Into Apples.
Okay.
It's a small poem. Into Apples. I intend to outlive the sad girl from Pennsylvania. I intend to get as close to indivisible as a girl from Pennsylvania can. Yes, and turn the burial ground we never visited into its very own September. In this, there will be a transformation, a love affair of sunlight and grass, gently, deliberately, turning sadness into apples.
They're exactly what I was talking about. I love the way that you often don't try to resolve your grief in many of your poems. There's a wonderful passage in Gilgamesh, the ancient text of Gilgamesh. It goes like this: all that is left to one who grieves is convalescence, no change of heart or spiritual conversion, for the heart has changed and the spirit has converted to a thing that sees how much it cost to lose a friend it loved. It goes on from,
beautiful.
In a beautiful way there, and later on in that same passage, it's just, the author, of course, the anonymous author now, says that it is that inner atmosphere with an unfamiliar gravity, where words are flung out and remain motionless about one's lips, arguing back with what one failed to say. Such a beautiful description. And I find that many of your poems reflect that same quality of grief in a beautiful way. You rely so heavily on imagery in your poems, and you seem almost addicted to imagery. Could you talk about your impulse to use imagery in your writing?
Well, I think that because I never had any formal training, I really don't know how other people write their poems, but my poems really bubble up from the unconscious, and it's often, through a moment or an object or a feeling in the wind or an apple or whatever that the emotion that I'm experiencing comes. And when a poem is successful, somehow the emotion I'm experiencing can then be conveyed.
Yeah.
And I think that it's just the way that my poems have always come.
What do you find about the clouds, the earth, the apple trees, these images that occur in your poems over and over again? Kind of what the landscape, what the art historian Simon Schama described as the text on which we write our recurrent obsessions, that landscape, that is so alluring to you.
Well, I do think that my poetry has always been something I write out of grief.
Yeah.
And to me, the antidote of grief is connection. It is, and I think that the natural world provides a sense of being alive and connected.
Yeah.
That I think as I try through my writing to resolve the interruptions in those important connections, I'm also trying to celebrate the connections that exist. And for me, nature is a big part of that.
Oh, that's beautifully put. You have a really beautiful poem called, a couple of poems called Mirror, January, and I think there's another one called Rearview Mirror, and there's another one called Rearview Mirror, February, I think. Would you mind reading one of those?
No.
Because I know they're probably a little tough to read, but they exemplify so well what you just said.
Is it okay if I read them both?
Sure, absolutely.
Rearview Mirror, January. My heart started beating inside you. I think of you when the road ices over, or when a certain scratching brings back the old record player that stood in the living room under the window, or when a road ends, when people give explanations for why terrible things happen. I was there when your heart stopped beating. I was small and sleeping in the twisted metal and the blood. It comes back like the sound of those old rotary phones, the one choking ring they make when they're slammed against the floor. Rearview Mirror, February. My beginning and your ending got so close that all traces of you in my memory lost hold. When I have nothing left to say, I have you, a series of disappearances, a street sign, a shade of turquoise, and a Formica table. A few decades later, we have hundreds of sadness medications. There is an information machine in everyone's pocket. We have nothing left to say, and we keep saying it. Take my face between your hands. Is this what you expected? I thought I would write this once, and instead, it is every time.
Mm-hmm. Those are two really beautiful poems. You work as a psychotherapist in Burlington.
Yeah.
When did, I know this doesn't deal directly with poetry perhaps, but maybe it does, decide to enter that profession or to become a psychotherapist, and how does it inform your writing?
Well, poetry was a love, but it never occurred to me that one could make a living at it. And all of the people I knew who were poets were professors, and I didn't like college that much that I would want to be in it all the time.
Yeah.
I was practical, and I am very interested in people, so I wanted to help people. I wanted to do good work. So I worked as a social worker for a long time, and then eventually got frustrated with agencies and all the frustrations of organizations that try to help people, and I wanted to just help people on my own, so I became a psychotherapist.
What frustrated you? Was it The
people are
bureaucracy?
terrible. Yes, bureaucracies and organizations and poor leadership and lack of resources and all the contradictions of sort of how we become very paternalistic with vulnerable people that we're trying to help. And it was just complicated. And I think that as I matured professionally, the thing that drove me most was both a desire to help and a great curiosity. And it is the wonderful thing about being a psychotherapist is you get to work with so many different people and hear so many different stories.
Yeah.
So I think that I don't know exactly how the psychotherapy and poetry connect. I think they're a nice balance because for me, psychotherapy is an opportunity to be really present and engaged with someone else's inner life and their process. And poetry is an opportunity for me to be very engaged and present in my own inner life. So I think it's a nice balance.
Yeah. Do you find the work inspiring at all to you, or do you keep them sort of
it's very separate? Both inspiring in very different ways. I do gain a lot of strength from working with other people, and other people and the way they face and process adversity is very inspiring to me just in living my life.
Yeah.
But it's very different than poetry.
Right. But there are similar sort of emotional emotional experiences, I think, that you have in both. I mean, the empathy that you must have for a lot of your patients or your clients is very similar to what John Keats called negative capability. For instance, being in mystery, doubt, and uncertainty, which is certainly what happens in the midst of therapy often, without any irritable reaching, he says, after fact and reason. And yet, what you do in your poetry is remarkable. You can't, you're there all by yourself in poetry. You're not there with the client or anybody else, and you create a speaker that crosses over to the reader in ways that isn't clinical or isn't medical in any way. And you're doing that with your metaphors, your symbols, your imagery in a way that takes that involves a whole other way of thinking. So I would love for you to read another poem, I think, in which that happens beautifully. Your poem, the engineer taught us, also your poem that has such wonderful attitude in it, which is, it's got Mr. in the title.
I would like to speak to the man in charge.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that. Mr. is at the end of the poem. Right. Either one of those, yes.
I would like to speak to the man in charge. The racket is like a drawer of silver clattering to the floor. This morning, outside my kitchen window, a sharp-shinned hawk tore apart a yellow bird in the apple tree. What do you propose we do when our questions become useless? Every day I forgive you these messes. Goodness is not a false positive. The bloodline is not a false positive, nor are the ghosts who raised me. Go ahead and wield your mighty blankness. I too can sing into my pillow, sir.
It's sir, not Mr. I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's good. How did you feel after you wrote that poem?
It was satisfying.
Yeah.
Again, I don't think I was very conscious of exactly what I was saying in the poem, as I often am when I'm writing. That I often don't know what my poem is about until I've worked on it for quite a while.
Right. How long do you work on these?
Most of the good ones, quite a while. I'm a prolific writer, and most of what I write is terrible.
Yeah.
And and then now and then something I write, I feel like there's really something here, and then I stay with it for a while. And sometimes it's a couple weeks, and sometimes it's a few years. That it'll just keep circling back, or there'll be something that I really feel is important in the poem, but I know it's not quite there, so it just keeps hanging around till I feel like I'm ready to put it out there.
could you talk just a little bit about the apostrophe in this poem, the direct address, and your decision to address that other in this poem that you just read as sir? That's a really interesting move there at the end of the poem.
Yeah, I think it comes from a little bit of an unconscious place, maybe my early experiences of God as being
masculine.
This man who I actually routinely confused with Santa Claus, because they both were making lists and you were either in good with them or you were in bad with them, and it was either rewards or punishments, and they were sort of making a plan, and everything was happening because of them.
Right.
And I think it came from that old place.
Yeah, yeah. But you update it into a very sort of adult and mature sensibility with that wonderful attitude. Do you ever think of writing as a kind of therapy? I know that's maybe a loaded word, especially given your profession.
I mean, I don't think of it as at all as psychotherapy, but in terms of being a part of recovery, I think I think we can use anything in which we feel truly grounded and connected as part of a recovery process for the many of us who've experienced trauma. So I think it could be poetry. For me, that's perfect. For someone else, it could be cooking. Yeah. It could be gardening. It could be miniature chains or working on cars or boating. I mean, I think anything can be therapy for us.
Right. Good. I agree. You have this wonderful phrase in one of your poems, the ongoing riddle of disorientation. What do you make of that phrase?
I'm not sure what I even meant by that. Some of my phrasing comes out of my poems, and again, I'm not sure what I'm saying. Yeah,
well, it's understandable. There's such an unconscious process. In this book, or this same passage that I quoted from earlier from Gilgamesh, the author uses the word privacy as the only sense of privacy. Let me read it for you. And because I wanted to relate it to something that you, to the word loneliness that you use instead of privacy. An unfamiliar gravity, I quoted this earlier, or none at all, where words are flung out in the air but stay motionless without an answer, hovering about one's lips, or arguing back to haunt the memory with what one failed to say until one learns acceptance of the silence amidst the new debris, or turns again to grief as the only source of privacy. Is privacy and loneliness almost synonymous there? I mean,
yeah, I think in the way that it's used there, it is. I mean, I think that, I guess the loneliness I'm talking about is just maybe the distance between ourselves and the things that we are the most attached to or the most important to us, and grief is an interruption of that. But I think that grief is always a very lonely. Each person grieves alone, ultimately, even though we all come together and try to help each other out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What are you working on now? I mean, are you?
I have another.
Writing.
I have another manuscript that's out there, and I just keep. And I'm always writing poetry, and so it sort of grows and changes as time goes by, and hopefully keeps getting better.
Do you feel feel that about the new work, and have you gotten much feedback from?
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten some great publications, and I feel, no one's taken the manuscript, which will be, of course, hopefully will happen one day. But
I'm sure it will.
But I feel good about the, again, the small percentage of my poems that I feel good about.
Excellent. Wonderful. I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but your work's been published very widely in such magazines as the Michigan Quarterly Review, Poet Lore, Shenandoah, Virginia Quarterly Review, Green Mountains Review right here in Vermont. These are all just wonderful publications, and so your work is really receiving wide recognition, which is well deserved. So you're sending new work
Yeah.
out as well now. So
Yeah, I mean, for a long time I didn't, like you mentioned at the beginning, I don't think I really wrote for an audience or understood that an audience existed. And when, it wasn't until I was in my 40s that I ever sent a poem out for publication. And that sort of opened a whole, I don't think I realized how satisfying it is to really have an audience and how that can help your work grow, the interaction between the reader and the poet.
When you first started publishing, you began to realize that?
Yeah, I mean, I had only, like a few poet friends who I shared work with, and that was certainly, a valuable relationship, but it's different to have people you don't know responding to your work.
Right. Well, so much of your poetry is intensely personal, so it must have been exhilarating to hear from a friend that it was crossing over to her or him in a way that affected them deeply. You've talked about your poems as prayer sometimes, secular prayer. Could you talk about that a little bit? What you mean by that?
Well, I guess it is, to me, those moments when you are most authentically yourself is a kind of prayer, and just whether that for some people it's through religion, but I believe that the creative process is also a way to just to honor life and connection in what to me feels like one of the most authentic ways.
Yeah, great. You've got a wonderful poem that I thought of as sort of a prayer called "I'm Sorry." Could you read that,
Sure.
if you don't mind? Page 24, I think.
Thanks. I am sorry for the moments in which I did not recognize you, that your love for me was like August, lush and fast and full of thicket, while I loved you like December, dark and spare and everlasting. I walked into your church wanting something outside the doctrine. Sorry the things I got close to believing were caught up in your yellow hair and the freckles splashed across your chest. I'm sorry that I have no second language with which I could grow to understand my first. What have you broken open and turned away from in all these years? I can't recall your laugh, but I remember waking each morning with your long limbs wound around me and wanting to throw them off.
Would you mind talking a little bit about the occasion of that poem?
I mean, I think that's a poem about, it was about really one of my first lovers, and I wasn't prepared to love in the way that she was prepared to love, and I think was able to give me a love that I couldn't return, and I think it's a little bit of a lament to that failure. Maybe just of timing.
Right. So beautifully expressed, though, in your poetic language. You've got another wonderful line that I pondered for quite a while after I read it. I wish I knew how many trees it takes to make a reason. I think it's a poem. I think it's a line that occurs in The Orchard. Is that? And you certainly can read that, but also maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
What did I mean? I mean, I think I don't know that I can put into words what I was trying to say in that line, only that, it was an impossible question, and it's really a poem about my brother who committed suicide, and that there isn't really an answer in nature or anywhere for those things.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, this is a wonderful quality that occurs so often in your poem, that there aren't answers.
Mm-hmm.
There are the occasions, often beautifully expressed metaphorically or symbolically, but are true to life in a way that admits that there aren't answers always, and that you're living with that. So they're courageous. They're very courageous.
Thank you.
I find often. Is there a poem that I haven't mentioned here, maybe, that you would like to read or talk about?
Do you want to hear a newer poem?
I would love to hear a new one. That would be a real treat.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a poem that I wrote a year ago in the spring. That's called Far North.
Great.
Spring rolls in hard, swift, brash, heedless. Box elder saplings, blackberry and burdock break ground any place we leave alone. A dozen dark purple tulips sprang up by the front steps. Did we plant them? Another gesture I can't remember. What I conceived, things I once said with such conviction, how I got from there to here. I am not the person who moved here from Pittsburgh decades ago, but I feel her inside me, earnest, righteous, drowning in want. I find a broken blue egg in front of our house, and I want to ask my wife if she believes it is an omen of loss or a beginning. Sometimes I find her crying in the shower. I am struck by all I can't take from her hands, like the water running between them.
Yes, like the water running between them. Beautiful new poem. What are you calling this new book? Do you know yet?
It changes, but right now it's called Ghostwriting My Autobiography.
Oh, very nice, very nice. How often are you able to write?
I try to write more days than not. At least a few mornings a week I write, and I have arranged my schedule. And when I started publication, it was with the support of my father, who was alive then, and my wife, who convinced me that it was okay to cut back on my practice, and I saved Friday. So on Fridays I'm a poet. And that's the time when I really work on revisions and sending things for publication.
So you have a real discipline. Then.
Oh, it's not. It doesn't feel like a discipline. It's like an indulgence, you know, for me to have that time. But I do set aside time very regularly for writing.
What poets have influenced you?
Well, countless. I would say poets have influenced me because I think because I didn't study poetry, I just learned by reading a lot. And I read, you know, I don't read as much older poetry as I did when I was younger. There's so many wonderful contemporary poets, and I, you know, even just other poets in Vermont that are so exciting to read.
Right. Right.
And you know, I think there's like a few wonderful poetry books that are just coming out this year. Bianca Stone's new book is stunning. Sue Burton has a book called Box that came out that is...
Yeah, we're lucky, aren't we, in Vermont? Right?
It's very rich.
Yeah.
Karen Gottschall, who's his dear friend of mine and also a brilliant...
Right, at Middlebury. Bianca, who's up in Goshen. The Moibus Strip Club of Grief about her grandmother, Ruth Stone, and... Karen McCadden, you know.
Yes, Karen McCadden's beautiful book that just came out a few years ago and won the Vermont Book Award.
Won the Vermont, a different year, I think.
Yeah, the first year, I can't remember which year it was, but I just finished reading a really gorgeous book by Victoria Chang called Barbie Chang, which I loved. It's
getting a lot of attention.
It's getting a lot of attention, and it should. It's a brilliant and very satisfying book. I don't always read a book from cover to cover, but that was one that I read every poem in the collection. And another favorite book I read in the last year or so is Vicky Now, who wrote a collection called The Old Philosopher, which is just a beautiful collection of poems. So, and Andrea Cohen, I don't know why I hadn't read her before,
Oh,
but
Andrea.
she's amazing. And I read her book that I think it came out last year
Uh-huh.
called Unfathoming. That
She's
just broke my heart.
old-
All these small,
Yeah, just the little epigrammatic poems,
Yes.
yeah, that are often very funny.
yeah,
Also,
humorous, but in a
but in a not just in a
not
funny
in a light way. Yeah,
No,
in
yeah.
a very
Yeah.
deep way.
She was my classmate.
Oh, really?
Yeah. She wasn't writing those short little poems, a long time ago, but she found them.
And
Yeah.
I think I have read some of her earlier work, but I love
Yeah.
those small poems.
Yeah, great. Well, do you have any new plans? Is this book pretty much finished? This new book?
Well, I don't suppose it will be finished until it gets published. So
right.
I don't know if there'll be a point at which I want to break off and make a sort of put that book aside.
Right.
It's been I don't know, some version of it was maybe finished a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
It may take a little
So you're
longer.
glad? You waited a long time to publish Steel. Are you?
Well, I wasn't waiting though. It hadn't even occurred to
It hadn't
me.
even
So
occurred to
it's
you.
really as soon as it occurred to me, I
Yeah.
got to work on it when
Yeah.
I felt ready. And
Some of the best books happen that way, don't they? Oh, it's a book. I didn't realize it was a book, or that I'd been working on a book for many, many years, and then suddenly it somehow just comes together
yeah.
that way. Well, Alison, we've run out of time, unfortunately. It's been so great to talk to you.
Thank you
and
so much, Charlie. It's an honor to be here talking with you.
It's an honor for me to talk to you. So I wish you all the best with your work and your job and your life.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.